Hi everybody, my name's Lou and I wanted to make a video today about a psychological concept that I want to sort of deconstruct philosophically and just practically. It's that of the fantasy self and of doing things because of your fantasy self, of why you shouldn't do things for a fantasy self. And this is something that I have seen discussed, particularly by finance influencers, people like Elle at Don't Be a Lemon and Kelsey Fagan of The Financial Diet. I watch a lot of their content and generally I really love these channels actually. I think they have excellent advice on how to get out of really bad shopping habits, about how to see through a lot of consumerist culture and materialism. And they often say things like, when they're trying to talk to their audience about how to sort of walk back from the ledge of any particular purchase, and they'll say things like, you know, are you buying this for your fantasy self? And I think I bought into this this approach to de-influencing oneself to a certain degree, and I was thinking, yeah, why would I buy this? Why would I purchase this, you know, pair of luxury sunglasses? These appeared in my last video. Why would I buy this fancy dress? Why would I want to spend the money on that new Fabergé diamond ring? Who am I buying it for? Is it for a fantasy self, a fantasy version of myself, some version of me that doesn't exist, will not exist, and it's just this sort of chimerical, illusory, fantastical idea that is unlikely to ever be realized, so what would be the point in investing in it? I honestly think this is probably not a brilliant way of thinking. I actually think there are so many things that are positive that we do in our lives that are for a fantasy version of ourselves. A lot of self-esteem is about closing the gap between where we are now and where we want to be. And if the where we want to be isn't a fantasy version of ourselves or a desired version of ourselves, then I don't know what it is, and I don't see how one can meaningfully have goals and strategies for self-improvement, whether that's something really substantive and deep, or in fact whether it's something way more superficial but which still holds clout, you know, socially and in the culture. And I was thinking of this alongside a concept that Doug Lisle talks about, and Doug Lisle's an evolutionary psychologist. This doesn't have a lot to do with evolution, of course, but he talks about the adjacent possible and the fact that in our lives, in any course of our lives, there are lots of different things that we could be doing. There are adjacents to this particular path that we're on. There's a potentially different version of us that is pursuing a course that is either sort of nearby, hypothetically, or it's a little more distant. But these are adjacents possible to the current narrative that we're playing out in our lives. And to take a different path, to manifest a different reality, to make real something that is actually plausible for us, actually realizable for us, we obviously need to make certain different decisions. We can't just keep doing the same thing as if it's Groundhog Day. My life, for instance, has been very much like Groundhog Day for the last 5 years. I started a business, as you know, and every day since starting that business, it has almost predictably been the same type of thing, because I've had essentially the same tasks to be doing. Obviously the scale of it has increased, and at no point was there an enormous pivot to something completely different. But starting the business was certainly a different path, and I had to do an entire 180, 360, whatever the phrase is, to realize that I had this potentiality, that I actually had a businesswoman inside of me, and I just needed to move a few things into place to see that actually my way of thinking, my way of working, and my virtues, my skills, and my strengths do align along sort of traditional business lines. And I, at the time, wouldn't have thought of that as a fantasy self. I actually had no real defined idea of who I wanted to be. I was at a crossroads in my life. I didn't know what was coming next. I just knew what I didn't want, and I didn't want to be a lecturer after having pursued my education to a very high degree and took it all away. So for me, realizing this side of myself and finding myself on this path was really a matter of just sort of closing my eyes and taking a leap. It wasn't about thinking, oh, what sort of fantasy life would I like to be leading, and what could I possibly do to manifest it. My process just didn't look like that at the time. But I think now that I'm obviously quite far into running a business, I'm sort of 5-6 years into it, and it's been very successful, and there comes a point where you do start to think, what else is there for me in this life? What would be more meaningful? What would create a greater sense of purpose? What would bring me that really elusive sense of vocation? And I think this is where you start to think of the fantasy self. And for me at the moment, I'm definitely grappling with this on a sort of deep level and on a superficial level. In my last video, I talked about how I obviously struggle with my body image, with my weight, with feeling acceptable to myself, and of really thinking, what can I be doing to manifest a glow up, to be seen differently in the world by myself, by my peers? How do I manifest a sort of more competitive edge, if you will, just physically? Because it's not nice when you feel like a sort of a dumpy Debbie Downer. And also just on a much deeper level of thinking, what will I want to do in 20 years' time? What do I need to be doing now to enable me to have a certain kind of retirement, or to, be able to wind back from working on my business and maybe handing over the reins and the power to somebody else? What would I need to be doing now to, let's say, realize my dream of running a cat sanctuary on a ranch in California? Or, if I want to retire at some point, which I most certainly do, what's that going to look like? And I did start making some changes in recent times. I started taking investing a lot more seriously. I used to be someone that just would hoard money in my current account, which is just completely stupid. But I had so much anxiety about my bank balance being a certain way that it was actually stopping me from growing my wealth, which is really stupid, because ultimately the anxiety was about financial security. And if you're placing your focus on just numbers in a current account, well, that's completely antithetical to actually building wealth. So I've had to grow a lot more comfortable with having a sort of lower balance in my current account and placing my money in other things. so that actually the truth of my life, the truth of my net worth is improving and is growing. But on a day-to-day basis, it means getting a lot more comfortable with, logging into my whatever, Barclays or whatever, and accepting that, okay, it's a lower number than I'd like. And I have similar experiences with my weight. When I was able to bodybuild, unfortunately, I can't do that anymore because I have upper body and lower body injuries. I had to accept that meant stepping on the scale sometimes and seeing a higher number. And obviously, having had a history of eating disorders and severe body image problems, where I had an obsession with certain numbers, like they sort of meant something even though they were almost entirely arbitrary. I had to get used to a physical reality, to a goal actually looking like a different set of metrics. And I think that's something that's incredibly hard to do if you have an anxious disposition, and if you've brainwashed yourself into thinking, no, success means that opening my bank account has to mean, a high six figures or something, or, stepping on the scale has to look like a number that starts with, a 4 or a 5, not a 6, not a 7. And I think when we're thinking of our fantasy selves, it's important that we pause and reflect on why we do certain things, why we're wedded to certain things. Why am I obsessed with things being this way when actually that keeps me stuck? Anyway, that's a bit of a tangent, but ultimately I think that obviously when you watch a certain type of content, content for recovering shopping addicts, or content for people that need to start being wiser with their money, start investing it rather than spending it on frivolities, that makes a whole lot of sense that you would want to encourage people away from, checking Net-a-Porter for, what's fashionable. And I do think, we do need to be mindful of when we're being influenced and when other people create desires in us for things we don't actually want or need. And I do think on social media that's incredibly important, and I certainly feel like I have no interest in selling you guys anything. I think we should all look inwards when we want to manifest a change in ourselves, when we want to spend our money, when we want to change our lives, change our houses, change our appearances for what will actually bring us greater joy, greater satisfaction. And I think a fantasy self is a useful tool. It's a very useful tool when we want to discover and explore something that will ultimately bring us to a version of ourselves that we might just be neglecting. And I think philosophically, there's a lot of philosophy about things like this, the sort of non-identity problem, where it's hard to know whether or if we have duties to people or even versions of ourselves that don't exist yet. And this is a theme in Derek Parfit, for instance. And I think it's very interesting to think of what our duties to ourselves are, insofar as that self hasn't yet materialized. It's a version of ourselves that is, somewhere down the line temporally, and it's potentially not even someone we can relate to or fully empathize with. But theoretically we can, and theoretically we can think, well, if that possible person is related to me in meaningful ways, that person shares my memories, it shares my affiliations, it shares my hopes and dreams potentially, then of course it makes sense that we would, from this point of view, from the point of view of the now, that we would care about who that is and what it would be correct to manifest that would be in their interest. And obviously, when it comes to things like, should I have a nose job or should I start getting my hair dyed professionally, these things are sort of rather moot points, really. They're not interesting. They don't have any tremendous philosophical or psychological weight. But obviously, when it comes to things like more vocational, more purposive, more teleological questions, it does get a lot more interesting. And I think that's when thinking about the sort of fantasy self, and I think that term is almost thrown around as a sort of laughable construct in a lot of sort of finance influence YouTube, and I think it's intended to deride and render risible the idea that you go shopping for things that will make you look like whatever, an influencer or a wag or Charles Leclerc's wife or something. And I get it. It is helpful to reframe things in a comedic way so that we disvalue what we are currently putting on a pedestal. I get it. It makes complete sense. But I do think there are helpful and important senses of fantasy selves that bring to bear what Doug Lisle says about the adjacent possible and about what philosophical questions around what we actually owe to that future self, what these things all bring together and actually make incredibly salient, and which we should actually slow down and really think about, because I know that I spend my days living an extremely similar week to week, and entire years can look eerily similar to one another. And I know that this is something that I absolutely have to do, and right now I have at least just some vague notions of what my fantasy self is on a sort of superficial level and on a much grander level. And you do need to plan for it. I think a lot of these YouTubers that want to use that language and laugh at it, I think they're actually missing something, because they themselves will advocate for planning for a future version of you that you should take extremely seriously, and you should make extremely detailed plans about how to manifest. And I think it's sometimes easy to think, well, the superficial shopping side of things, where you go looking for a pair of shoes that are for a fantasy self, how is that different from doing other things that are for a fantasy self? I think sometimes these things coincide in ways that it's easy to miss, and I think it's important to try to untangle and to clarify where those things meaningfully coincide, and what, the version of myself that is retired with a cat sanctuary, what does that person look like? I think that's not a joke question. What will that person be like from a health point of view? What would that person need to do now, not just financially in terms of investments and work, but how should that person be looking after their body if that's going to be realistic? Should that person learn to drive? I obviously have this dream, this fantasy of having this cat rescue center / ranch, and it is a fantasy because I'm not able to drive, and I'm not able to do a lot of the things that it would actually take to be an effective person doing that, and for me not to end up actually disempowered and needing to delegate a lot of the work to other people, and also therefore a lot of the meaning to other people. So that's just something I wanted to talk about, and I think it's just really interesting, and I just don't want to laugh at the concept of a fantasy self too readily. Obviously, I understand that we don't want to be a slave to sort of fashions and just trends that cost a fortune and last 20 minutes. Obviously, I want us to all be a lot more mindful about what it's worth spending our money on, and that's a completely valuable exercise. But I do think thinking and taking seriously the fantasy self, and fantasies aren't ridiculous. They can be something you think really strategically about. They can actually give meaning to the person you are today because they anchor a set of values and they regulate a set of ideals that will provide stepping stones for a future that you might need to work really hard to manifest. And to me, that's no joke. So I'd love to hear your thoughts, and yeah, talk to you soon. Bye.